The lake lay quiet under a soft August sun, a sheet of blue glass folded into the dark green ribs of the Smokies. Up on the ridge, the wind combed through the pines and slid down to the water in warm breaths, carrying the resin-sweet smell of needles and sun-baked wood. Near the shoreline, stones warmed all morning held the heat like little hearths, and minnows stitched silver threads just beyond the reeds. It was the kind of afternoon that asks for nothing, just a place to sit and listen. Helen Parker had chosen a flat rock the color of slate, shoes off, toes pressed to the sand where the water could come and go. A little boy crouched beside her, tan knees, bright eyes, a serious concentration that only children bring to tiny moving things. Every few moments he leaned forward, paused, and then pulled back quickly when a ripple licked the sand. He giggled, then pretended he hadn't, and Helen pretended she didn't notice, because that made the game better. She pointed to a patch of sun where the stones made a warm island. "There," she murmured, and he followed her finger. A lizard, small, quick, the color of wet bark, zipped from shadow to light, froze, and lifted its head like a king tasting his own air. The boy's breath caught. He eased his palm forward, fingers splayed the way Helen had shown him, slow as whispering. The creature twitched and streaked 2 stones over, stopping again in a coin of sun. "Am I seeing a wildlife rescue in progress?" a voice said, amused and gentle. "Or an attempted jailbreak?" Helen looked up. The man stood a few steps back out of courtesy, as if careful not to scatter the moment. Early 50s, maybe. Broad-shouldered, but relaxed in a way that didn't ask anything of the world. Ball cap in his hand. A day's growth softening a face you'd call kind before you called it handsome. His eyes were light, lake-light, and he smiled without taking aim with it. "Depends who you ask," Helen said. "He thinks he's a zoologist. I'm lobbying for observer status." The boy flicked his gaze up, decided the new voice was friendly enough, and returned to his mission. "It likes the hot rocks," he announced in a hush. The man crouched, keeping his weight balanced back so the stones wouldn't clatter. "He's right," he said softly, parting a sliver of grass with 2 fingers. "See that? He's chasing the sun. Lizards are little solar panels." He set his cap down beside the boy and angled one flat pebble into another to make a shallow V. "If you guide him a little, not trap him, just guide, you might get a closer look." Helen watched the way he moved, careful, patient, teaching without making a show of it. The boy mirrored him, pebble to pebble, breath steady the way kids can be steady when it matters. The lizard darted forward, paused in the cradle of warm stone, and the boy held his hands like a shelter above it without touching, eyes wide, mouth open in a soundless wow. A beat later, the lizard made its decision and fled into the grass, gone except for the tiny tremble of a blade left swaying. That, the man said, is a successful scientific observation. The boy straightened, flushed with triumph. He picked up the cap, set it on his own head backward with ceremony, and then returned it to its owner as if returning a crown. "Thank you," he said, all seriousness again. "Any time, buddy." The man took the cap and stood. He looked to Helen. "Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in." "You didn't," she said. "You read the room. Or the rocks." He grinned. "Thomas. Helen." They shook hands the way strangers do when the day is easy and the names feel like a good idea. Up the shore, a pontoon boat hummed by, its wake whispering into the shallows. On the opposite bank, a pair of kayaks drifted through a slice of reflected sky, paddles dipping soundlessly. Somewhere behind them, a family laughed over a cooler lid that wouldn't stay shut. The lake kept everything gentle, even the noise. "Locals or visitors?" he asked. "Local enough," Helen said. "Asheville. We escape down here when the city heat gets personal." "Same," Thomas said. "I try to make it out when the shop is quiet." He glanced at the boy with conspirator's respect. "Field trips are mandatory for proper scientists." The boy, content now to choose rocks based on shape alone, made small towers and knocked them down, entirely satisfied with the physics of it. Helen looked back at Thomas. There was something about him that didn't press. No sales pitch, no social small talk that asked for her bio before introducing his own. Just the ease of someone comfortable in the company of water and time. It made her aware in that private way of how long it had been since a stranger's presence felt like permission to breathe deeper. "Thank you for the assist," she said. "He would have engineered a full-scale lizard relocation without your V-shaped innovation." "Happy to be a consultant," he said. "My rates are very competitive. 1 lake afternoon per hour." "Dangerous," she said, a corner of her mouth lifting. "You might get hired." They stood in a companionable quiet. No need to fill it, watching sunlight slide along the surface as a cloud wandered over and then away. The boy's towers grew more ambitious. Thomas tilted his head toward the treeline. "There's a short trail up there," he said. "Pine shade, good view back down the cove. If your scientist wants to test his climbing hypothesis." "He's working on a peer-reviewed stack at the moment," Helen said. "But the shade sounds perfect." Thomas nodded, accepting the answer as if it had been a plan they made together. He dusted his palms and took a small step back. "Well, I should go let the afternoon keep doing its job." She found herself not wanting to let the moment close without at least naming it. Not romance, nothing heavy, nothing invented. Just the honest recognition of a good presence where there hadn't been one a minute ago. "Thomas," she said, and he paused. "Thanks for the guidance. With the solar panel." He laughed quietly, eyes meeting hers. Sunlight clipped across them, and for a fleeting beat the lake put a shine on everything, as if to say, "Pay attention. This is how doors open," quietly with courtesy. "Maybe we'll see each other again," he asked, voice light, offering the idea the way he'd offered the Pebble V, guiding, not trapping. "Maybe we will," Helen said, and the water laid a soft lace at their feet, as if the lake itself approved. Late September turned Asheville golden. The air carried that quiet promise of fall, the kind that made you crave coffee before noon. Helen Parker parked her car outside a small downtown grocery, one of those local stores where the owner knew everyone by name and the smell of baked bread greeted you at the door. She didn't expect to see him there, Thomas Reed, the man from Fontana Lake. But as she reached for a basket, she heard his voice at the counter, calm and familiar, asking if they still carried the local honey he liked. When he turned and their eyes met, both froze for a second, as if the memory of sunlight and ripples from that day at the lake had followed them here. "Well, if it isn't the scientist's assistant," he said, smiling. Helen laughed. "And the lizard consultant himself." They fell into easy conversation, just as they had that afternoon. He asked about her son, how old he was now, if he still chased lizards. She told him Logan had started college in Charlotte, leaving the house quieter than she was ready for. He nodded, understanding in that way people do when they've known solitude too long. They ended up leaving the store together, each with a paper bag and no reason to part right away. He offered to carry her groceries to the car. She declined, but he followed anyway, joking that he'd take offense if she didn't let him at least earn half a point for chivalry. Outside, the breeze tugged at her hair, and something in the simplicity of it, the light, the warmth, the comfort, felt like coming home. He asked if she'd join him for coffee. She hesitated, then said yes. At the cafe on Lexington Avenue, they sat near the window, the hum of espresso machines weaving through their conversation. Thomas talked about his work, engineering projects for a small firm that specialized in retrofitting old machinery for new uses. "It keeps me busy enough to forget the world for a bit," he said. Then, softer, "My mother used to say I fix things because I can't fix what matters." Helen didn't press. She just listened. When he finally looked up, his eyes carried the quiet honesty of someone who'd lived long enough to stop pretending. She told him about her own life, how she'd divorced years ago, after realizing she was the only one trying to keep a marriage alive. "I'm not bitter," she said. "Just tired of pretending being alone is the worst thing." "It isn't," Thomas said. "Sometimes it's where you start breathing again." The words settled between them. Not heavy, not dramatic, just true. They met again the next week. What began as coffee turned into walks through the River Arts District. Then small errands together that didn't need two people, but somehow made sense that way. Helen liked how quiet he could be without it feeling awkward. He noticed small things when she got lost in thought, when she skipped lunch, when she rubbed her wrist out of habit from an old injury. "You should rest it," he'd say, pouring tea before she could protest. He had a way of taking care of others that wasn't intrusive, almost as if he'd learned it from loss. One evening, when the sky bruised into pink and violet, he invited her over for dinner. His home sat on the edge of town, a modest single-story with ivy creeping up the porch rail. The smell of garlic and rosemary greeted her before he did. Inside, candles flickered on the counter. "You cooked all this?" she asked. "That depends," he said, tasting a sauce. "Does reheating count as cooking?" But the meal was no joke. Grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, a bottle of wine that looked like it had been waiting for the right reason. Over dinner, they talked about nothing and everything. The weather, her favorite books, his mother's garden, the one he never managed to keep alive after she passed. She was the kind of person who believed every seed deserved a chance, he said, smiling faintly. "I guess that's how she raised me." Helen watched him for a moment. There was strength there, but the gentle kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. She realized she'd forgotten what that looked like in a man. After the dishes were cleared, he offered coffee, but neither of them really wanted it. The evening had stretched into something fragile and beautiful, like a quiet song you don't want to end. They moved to the porch, the crickets tuning the night, the scent of pine soft in the air. She talked about Logan, about how motherhood had defined her so fully that she sometimes forgot the rest of herself. "He's grown now," she said, "but I still wake up thinking I should make him breakfast." "Maybe make it for yourself," Thomas said, voice low, not lecturing. "He learned that from you, how to take care of people. Maybe it's time you remember where he learned it." She smiled, not because it was clever, but because it was kind. They sat in silence, listening to the hum of the woods beyond the porch light. The world felt hushed, almost reverent. Thomas reached over, not to hold her hand, but to brush a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering just long enough for warmth to register. For the first time in years, Helen didn't feel the weight of expectation or the echo of disappointment. She didn't feel alone. The night folded gently around them, the lake's memory shimmering somewhere behind the stars. And as she drove home later, headlights cutting through the dark, she caught herself smiling, not from excitement, not from fantasy, but from something deeper. It was the rarest feeling of all, peace. 8 years passed almost without Helen noticing. What began as coffee and quiet dinners had folded seamlessly into a life. One built not on grand declarations, but on the small rhythms that made up ordinary days. She and Thomas never married. They didn't feel the need. Paperwork, they agreed, wouldn't make what they already shared any more real. They simply lived side by side in a modest house near the edge of Asheville, with a forest pressed close enough that they could hear the trees breathe when the wind moved through them. Every morning, Thomas rose first. He was the kind of man who liked the day before it was fully awake. By the time Helen walked into the kitchen, still half wrapped in sleep, he would have the coffee waiting, the smell filling the house before the sun had cleared the ridge. "You'll never convert me into an early bird," she'd mumble, and he'd smile, sliding a plate toward her. Toast, eggs, sometimes pancakes when he felt indulgent. Logan, her son, visited when work allowed, always greeted like family by Thomas. The two of them bonded easily, in that understated way men often do, talking about cars, music, or how to fix whatever needed fixing around the house. Logan once told her after a weekend visit, "He treats me like he's been my dad forever." Helen smiled and said nothing, but her chest ached pleasantly at the truth of it. Thomas never tried to replace anyone. He simply filled the space with quiet steadiness. Their life together found a pace that was gentle and predictable. On weekends, they drove out along the Blue Ridge Parkway with the windows down, the air carrying the sharp scent of pine and rain. Sometimes they stopped at roadside fruit stands or hiked short trails to waterfalls that seemed to appear only for them. At home, they tended to a small garden behind the house, a mix of wildflowers, herbs, and tomatoes that Thomas insisted on growing despite the deer that often helped themselves at night. Helen laughed about it, saying he was feeding the neighborhood wildlife, and he'd answer, "That's fine." They were here first. Evenings were her favorite. They'd sit on the porch swing, wine glasses resting on the wooden railing, listening to cicadas hum as dusk stretched over the hills. He'd tell her stories about his work, about how machinery sometimes behaved more predictably than people, and she'd talk about her clients, the endless paperwork of accounting, and the small dramas of human nature hidden in numbers. They didn't need constant conversation. The silence between them was never empty. Sometimes, when she caught his reflection in the window, his shoulders relaxed, his face calm in the fading light, she wondered how she had ever lived differently. There had been a time long ago when love had meant tension and doubt, when every quiet moment felt like the calm before an argument. Her ex-husband, Mark, had been charming when sober, cruel when not. He'd promised her stability but brought chaos instead. She remembered nights waiting for the sound of the door, not knowing which version of him would walk through. She remembered the exhaustion of explaining, forgiving, and starting over again and again, until the hope wore thin. Thomas never asked about that life, though he must have known pieces of it. Once, after she woke from a nightmare, shaken, heart pounding, he only said, "You don't have to tell me. I just need to know you're safe now." And somehow that was enough. Years rolled by in their quiet rhythm. They built traditions, Sunday breakfasts on the porch, movie nights with too much popcorn, annual trips to Fontana Lake where it had all begun. Each time they returned, the water shimmered the same, though they were older, softer around the edges. Neighbors called them the Reeds, assuming they were married. Helen never corrected anyone. It didn't matter. What they had didn't fit into neat definitions. It was partnership, friendship, and something steadier than either of them had dared to hope for. On their 7th summer together, Thomas surprised her with a small bench he had built himself. He placed it in the garden under a dogwood tree and carved 2 simple initials on the side, H and T, for when we're too tired to weed, he joked. But she knew what it really meant, a quiet monument to the life they'd made, to the peace they'd earned. One evening, as fireflies began to blink across the yard, Helen sat on that bench, watching Thomas fuss over the tomato plants, pretending not to see the deer lurking by the fence. She felt an ache rise in her chest, not from fear or sadness, but from a fullness she couldn't quite name. For so long, she had waited for life to stop demanding proof of her endurance. And now, looking at this man, this home, this simple calm that asked for nothing but her presence, she finally understood. Maybe this is what patience is for, she thought. Not waiting for miracles, but waiting long enough for peace to find you. She smiled to herself, closed her eyes, and listened to the low hum of crickets. For the first time in her life, she didn't wish for anything to change. By the time the dogwoods bloomed again, Thomas had been offered a short consulting job out of state. 3 weeks in Atlanta, helping an old colleague troubleshoot a stalled factory project. Helen packed his bags the night before, folding his shirts the way she always did, sleeves tucked in just so, the scent of cedar sachets filling the room. "You'll only be gone 21 days, she said, more to herself than to him. "That's nothing." "That's long enough to miss your cooking," he teased, though they both knew she rarely cooked when he was away. He kissed her temple, lingering. "You'll be fine, won't you?" "I've managed before," she said. But when he smiled and turned away to zip his bag, she felt that small, silly tightening in her chest, the one that reminded her how quiet the house became without him. The next morning, they drove before sunrise. The highway was nearly empty, the world washed in shades of pale blue. Thomas liked early departures, the same way he liked clean beginnings. He hummed along to an old Springsteen song on the radio, tapping his thumb on the steering wheel. Helen, half awake, watched fog lift off the meadows as the first light broke through the trees. At the station, he checked his watch, always punctual. "I'll call when I get there," he said, hefting his duffel bag. "And if the car makes that noise again, call the mechanic. Don't wait for me." She nodded, smiled, and straightened his collar like she always did. "You worry too much." "That's my job," he said softly. He boarded the train with a wave, glancing back once before the doors closed. Helen stood there until the car disappeared into the curve of the tracks. Then she walked back through the quiet station to where she'd parked. The car still held the warmth of his presence, the faint smell of aftershave, the folded map in the glove box, the travel mug half full of cold coffee. She started the engine, reversed out, and noticed something black wedged between the passenger seat and the console. A notebook. It was thick, leather-bound, with a loop for a pen still holding a dark blue ballpoint. She turned it over in her hands. No name on the cover, but the initials TR were faintly pressed into the corner. For a moment, she smiled. Of course he would keep notes on everything, meticulous as always. Then she frowned. He hadn't mentioned it when he left. At the first red light, she pulled out her phone, meaning to call him, but the train would already be out of range. He wouldn't check his messages until evening. She set the notebook on the passenger seat and told herself she'd send it by mail. But by the time she reached home, the small object had grown heavier in her mind. It wasn't suspicion. Thomas had never given her reason for that. It was something else, a stirring of curiosity she couldn't quite name. She placed the notebook on the kitchen counter, meaning to forget it. But each time she passed, the dark cover caught the light, as if it were breathing quietly, waiting. By late afternoon, she gave up pretending. She made tea, sat on the couch, and opened it. The first pages were ordinary. Project notes, to-do lists, sketches of machines with his precise handwriting marking angles and numbers. She flipped through absently, smiling at the predictability of him. Then, somewhere in the middle, a line stopped her. Caroline, January 5th. I drove by the hospice again. The lights were still on in her room. Helen froze. Caroline. The name appeared again, underlined this time. And another, Emily. Emily starts school tomorrow. She looks so much like her mother it hurts. Her pulse quickened. She turned the page, then another. The entries weren't technical anymore. They were memories, fragments of something private and raw. I promised I'd find her if I ever could. Caroline made me swear it. I never did. Helen closed the book halfway, staring at the wall. She knew she should stop. This wasn't meant for her. She should have never opened it. But her hands didn't listen. They moved on their own, flipping another page. 8 years, and I still see her face in every crowd. Emily would be a grown woman now. Maybe married. Maybe still waiting for answers she'll never get. Helen's breath caught. The name repeated like a heartbeat. Caroline, Emily, Caroline. The writing grew unsteady, the tone different from the calm man she knew. It was grief, unfiltered and old, but alive. She read another line. If only I had told Helen. But what right do I have to reopen a past that should have stayed buried? Her throat tightened. The cup of tea had gone cold beside her. She shut the notebook at last, as if closing it could undo what she'd seen. The silence of the house pressed around her. Guilt bloomed first, sharp, immediate. She had invaded something sacred. But under it, fear stirred too. Not the fear of betrayal, but of what this might mean for him, for them. Who was Caroline? A lost love, clearly. But Emily? The way he wrote about her, it wasn't just memory. It was responsibility. She stood, pacing, the notebook still in her hand. She told herself she wouldn't read more, that she'd give it back untouched and confess what she'd done. But a small, stubborn part of her, the part that had survived disappointment and lies before, whispered that she needed to know the truth before facing him. Helen walked to the window. Outside, the light was fading, the garden she and Thomas had tended slipping into shadow. She looked down at the notebook once more, at the imprint of his initials. Her heart pounded with a strange mix of shame and compassion. This isn't just a journal, she thought. It's a map of something unfinished. And though she didn't know why, she felt certain of one thing. Whatever story lay inside those pages, it wasn't over yet. Helen sat at the kitchen table long after the daylight had drained from the windows. The little black notebook lay open in front of her, its pages curled slightly from her touch. She had promised herself she would stop, that she'd seen enough. But something about the final line she'd read wouldn't let her go. The words clung to her chest, whispering that she hadn't reached the end of the story yet. With a slow breath, she turned another page. March 14th. Caroline's handwriting trembled today. She knows. She didn't have to say it. I could see it in her eyes. The entry bled into another. She's tired. The doctors say the treatments aren't working anymore. I told her I'd come every day, that she wouldn't face it alone. She smiled like she always did, brave for my sake. God, she's always thinking of everyone else first. Helen's hands tightened around the notebook. Caroline. The name had weight now, a woman who had once filled Thomas's world with tenderness and loss. There was no anger in the way he wrote about her, only grief and guilt, layered over years like rings inside a tree. The next page wasn't in his handwriting. It was smaller, rounder, feminine. A letter dated years ago, tucked between his notes. Thomas, it began, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I didn't have the courage to tell you in person. You were always too kind, too gentle. You would have tried to save me, and I couldn't let you carry that weight again. There's something you should know before the end. Emily, she's yours. Helen's breath hitched. The words blurred as she kept reading. I didn't tell you because you had just rebuilt your life after your divorce. I thought it would destroy the fragile peace you'd finally found. But Emily deserves to know one day who her father is. If life is kind, maybe you'll find her when she's ready to understand. Don't hate me for this. I wanted to tell you, I just ran out of time. The page ended with a small ink blot, as if the pen had trembled. Helen sat there motionless, the clock ticking behind her like a slow heartbeat. She reread the letter 3 times, as if her mind refused to believe it. Emily was his daughter. She closed the notebook carefully, her palms cold against the leather. Her first feeling wasn't jealousy. It was something deeper, stranger, a quiet ache of empathy. Caroline had been dying and afraid. Thomas had been left with the shadow of a child he didn't know. And now, after all these years, he still carried that wound in silence. Helen pressed her fingers to her temples. For 8 years, she had known him as the most open man she'd ever met. And yet here, in his steady hands and easy laughter, he'd hidden this, grief that never found closure. She thought of how he always avoided talking about his past before Asheville, how his eyes would darken for just a second whenever she asked if he had family somewhere. She'd assumed it was loneliness. It was loss. She should have felt betrayed. But instead, she felt sorrow, both for him and for the woman who'd loved him before her. Helen turned off the kitchen light and moved to the porch. The night was still, the air smelling faintly of rain and pine. She stared into the dark yard, the weight of what she'd learned pressing on her. She could tell him. She could hand him the notebook and confess she'd read it, that she knew everything. But the thought of watching his face when he saw that letter, the raw pain that would follow, froze her. He'd spent years searching for peace. Would reopening that wound undo all of it? She whispered to the quiet, "What would I want if it were me?" And she knew. She wouldn't want pity or confrontation. She'd want help. Helen took a deep breath and went back inside. She found her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and tapped the name that always made her heart settle, Logan. Her son answered on the second ring, his voice groggy but warm. "Mom? Everything okay?" "Yeah," she said, steadying her voice. "Listen, I need your help with something. It's about someone your stepdad used to know." There was a pause. "Okay, What kind of help? I need to find someone. A woman named Emily Whitmore. She'd be in her late 20s now. I don't have much to go on. Just that name and maybe Georgia or Tennessee. I'm not sure. He hesitated. Is this for Dad? Helen looked at the closed notebook. In a way, yes. But don't tell him. Please. Logan's tone softened, curious but trusting. All right. I'll see what I can do. You'll tell me the rest when you're ready. I will. When she hung up, Helen exhaled for the first time in hours. She placed the notebook back in the drawer beside the couch and stared at the dark wood grain as if it could keep her secret. Guilt still burned quietly under her ribs, but alongside it came something else, a fragile resolve. She couldn't erase the past, and she couldn't undo the lie of omission. But she could give him the truth he'd been denied for too long. In the dim light of the porch, she whispered, "You'll have her, Thomas, one way or another." And though the night offered no answer, Helen felt certain the choice she'd made, between jealousy and love, between silence and compassion, was the right one. The following week unfolded in a blur of late nights and quiet secrecy. Helen tried to keep the rhythm of normal life. Work, garden, calls with Thomas in Atlanta. But every time she walked past the drawer where the black notebook lay, her thoughts strayed. The guilt hadn't faded. It had simply turned into purpose. She couldn't tell Thomas yet, but she could make sure the search he'd once begun didn't stay unfinished. Logan called one evening, his voice filled with that same energy he used to have as a kid solving puzzles. "Okay, Mom, I think I've got something. You said her name's Emily Whitmore, right? Born maybe late 90s. "Yes," Helen said, gripping the phone tighter. That's what the letter suggested. "There are a few possibilities," he said, typing in the background. "One in Spokane, one in Georgia, and two that don't have much public info. The one in Spokane is a photographer. Small business, wedding shoots mostly. The Georgia one works at a rehab center, according to LinkedIn." Helen took notes as he talked. She'd be around 28. Caroline, her mother, passed when she was still a child. The Spokane one, could she have family listed? "Let me check." A pause, more typing. "There's a mention of a mother named Caroline in an old community fundraiser post, in memory of Caroline Whitmore. That could be her." Helen's chest tightened. "That's her, Logan. It has to be. Want me to reach out?" "No," she said quickly. "Not yet. Let me try first." She hung up and sat at the dining table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. On her laptop, she typed Emily Whitmore Spokane photography into the search bar. The screen filled with images, portraits, landscapes, weddings. The work was beautiful, full of light and life. Helen scrolled slowly, her eyes catching on one photo of a woman holding a camera, smiling shyly at someone off frame. Her hair was light brown, her expression open but cautious. She whispered the name to herself, Emily. After staring at the screen for what felt like hours, she opened a blank message on social media. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. How did you start a conversation like this? How did you tell someone that a man they didn't know might be their father? She typed, erased, and typed again. Finally, she wrote, "Hello, Emily. My name is Helen Parker. I hope you'll forgive this message from a stranger. I believe I may have information about your mother, Caroline. It's something important, something I think she'd want you to know. If you'd be willing to talk, I promise I'll explain everything." Her hand trembled as she hit send. Hours passed. No reply. The next morning, she checked again before work. Nothing. That evening, still nothing. She tried to tell herself not to expect an answer right away. Emily had no reason to trust her, and even less reason to believe her story. By the third day, Logan called again. "Any luck?" "Not yet," Helen said. "She hasn't seen the message." "I can help boost the search," he said. "Sophie's good at that sort of thing." Sophie was his girlfriend, a data analyst with a knack for digging through online trails. Helen hesitated, then agreed. That night, the three of them were on a video call. Sophie shared her screen, typing with practiced speed. "Okay," she said. "Emily's Facebook is mostly private, but her business page is public. There's a contact email there, probably for clients. We can send something more official looking, so it doesn't seem random." "I don't want to scare her," Helen said. "She's already been through enough." Sophie nodded. "We'll keep it simple. Just say you have personal information about her mother and ask if she's open to a conversation. I can help you word it." They crafted the message together, carefully choosing each sentence. It was kind, respectful, and free of anything that might sound invasive. When Helen sent it, she felt her pulse hammering in her ears. 2 days later, a reply arrived, not from Emily directly, but from her business account. "Thank you for your message. Could you tell me what this is about? I don't remember a Helen Parker." Helen's heart jumped. She wrote back carefully. "You wouldn't know me, but I knew someone who cared for your mother deeply, Thomas Reed. I found something that belonged to him, and it mentioned you. I'm not asking for anything. I just want to make sure you have the truth." Minutes stretched into hours. That night, a new message appeared. "I don't know who you are or what this is about, but please stop contacting me. My mother passed a long time ago. I'm not interested in scams or emotional stories. Don't reach out again." The word stung, though Helen couldn't blame her. She sat at the desk, staring at the screen, torn between frustration and guilt. She typed a reply and deleted it twice before finally writing, "I understand. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I can prove what I'm saying. I have her handwriting and yours when you were a child. I can send a photo from the journal if you wish. I promise this isn't about money or anything like that. Just truth." She attached a photo of the page from Caroline's letter, her hand shaking as she pressed send. Then she waited for hours. Refresh. Nothing. Refresh again. Still nothing. Logan called later that evening. "Any word?" Helen looked at the dark laptop screen, the faint glow of her unsent thoughts reflected in the glass. "No," she said quietly. "Not yet." After he hung up, she remained there in the half-light of the room, listening to the house settle around her. The night outside was soft, patient, almost kind, but her mind wasn't. Every tick of the clock felt like a question she couldn't answer. On the screen, the message thread stayed frozen. The last words marked scene 9:40, 2 p.m. Helen folded her arms around herself, eyes fixed on that unread silence, wondering if she had done the right thing, or if she had just torn open a wound that was never meant to heal. The message from Emily came almost 2 weeks later, long after Helen had convinced herself the silence was permanent. It arrived late on a quiet Sunday night when the house was wrapped in the sound of rain, and she almost missed the notification. "Ms. Parker, I've thought about your message. If what you said is true, I want to know. But I need proof. I'm willing to do a DNA test if that's really what this is about." Helen stared at the words, her heart thudding. She read them 3 times before exhaling a shaky breath. Proof. The one thing that could make this real. The next morning, she called Logan. "She's agreed," she said. He didn't hesitate. "Then we'll make it happen." They met at her house that evening, laptops open, searching for certified DNA testing services. Sophie joined the call too, helping them compare labs that handled family verification cases. They chose a reputable one in Seattle, a mail-in service that required just 2 samples, a cheek swab from each person. Discreet, fast, private. Helen's chest tightened when she saw the order confirmation. It wasn't the logistics that worried her, it was what came next. How do you take something so intimate from the man you love without him knowing? She told herself she'd find a way, not out of deceit, but out of love, because the truth belonged to him as much as it did to Emily. When the test kit arrived 3 days later, Helen hid it in the drawer beside the notebook. Each night after that, she found herself watching Thomas more closely, His gestures, his laughter, the lines near his eyes when he smiled. How could he not know that somewhere out there, a woman carried his kindness in her face? She thought about telling him the truth each time they sat down to dinner, each time he asked how her day was. But every time she opened her mouth, the words lodged in her throat. She couldn't shatter his peace until she was sure. One morning, he left early for a site visit. She stood by the bedroom door, watching him tie his shoes, humming softly to himself. On the dresser sat his hairbrush, still holding a few short strands of silver and brown. Her stomach twisted. After he drove away, she walked to the dresser, hands trembling. She lifted the brush carefully, plucked out 2 strands, and sealed them in the small collection envelope from the kit. Her breath came shallow, as if she'd done something forbidden. When she sealed the package later that day, she whispered a silent prayer that he'd one day understand. A week passed before the results arrived. Helen sat beside Logan at her dining table, both of them staring at the email notification on her screen. Neither spoke for a moment. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad, then clicked. The report opened with clinical precision. Participant A. Thomas Reed. Participant B. Emily Whitmore. Below, a line of black text. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. The air left her lungs all at once. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't even blink. Logan leaned in, reading the words twice before exhaling. "It's her," he said softly. "It's really her." Helen pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes filling. "Oh, Thomas!" They sat there in silence for a while, the rain tapping against the window, just like it had the night she'd first written to Emily. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the ache. She imagined him finally knowing, holding that truth, his eyes soft with gratitude and pain. He'd searched for years and never found her. And now, when the truth had finally surfaced, it came through secrecy instead of fate. Logan reached over, squeezing her hand. "You did the right thing, Mom." "Maybe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but it still feels like a lie." "You did it for him," he said. "That's love, not betrayal." Helen managed a faint smile, though her heart ached with the weight of both. "He's been carrying this for so long, Logan. Maybe it's time someone else carried a piece of it for him." They printed the report and placed it in a plain folder. Helen tucked it beside the black notebook, sealing both away in the drawer again. She wasn't ready to tell him, not yet. Thomas deserved the truth, but he also deserved the right moment, the right piece to receive it. That night, after Logan left, she made tea and sat by the window with the notebook open on her lap. The pages smelled faintly of thyme and cedar. She turned to the letter again, tracing Caroline's handwriting with her fingertips. "Emily, she's yours." Tears came before she realized it. Not the sharp tears of pain, but the kind that arrive quietly when joy and sorrow share the same space. She wept for the woman who had loved Thomas enough to let him go, for the daughter who had grown up without knowing his name, and for the man who still hummed in the mornings, unaware that his lost past was finally reaching back to him. When the tears slowed, she looked out the window. The garden shimmered in the moonlight, rain still clinging to the leaves. Somewhere in the soft darkness, she felt the strange, steady calm of something righting itself in the world. For the first time in years, Helen cried not from heartbreak or loss, but from a rare, selfless joy, the kind that asked for nothing in return. She closed the notebook gently, pressing her palm against its cover as if sealing a promise. "Soon," she whispered into the quiet. "You'll know soon." And for the first time since she had opened that black leather book, she felt at peace with the secret she was keeping, not as a burden, but as a gift waiting for the right moment to be given. For days after receiving the DNA report, Helen couldn't stop thinking about the girl she had never met but already felt connected to. She wanted to write to Emily again, to tell her everything, but she hesitated. How do you tell someone that the life they've known is about to change? She checked her messages every morning, hoping for a sign that Emily had seen the results she'd sent. Proof, undeniable and pure. But silence lingered like a held breath. In Spokane, Emily sat at her kitchen table with the report open on her laptop. Her hands trembled slightly as she reread the email from Helen, her mind spinning through memories that suddenly felt rewritten. Caroline Whitmore, her mother, had always been gentle, private, but there had been secrets in her eyes too. Questions Emily had asked as a teenager had always been met with the same vague answers. He was a friend, someone who helped us when things were hard. At the time, she thought it meant a kind neighbor or distant relative. She had never imagined it could mean her father. Jacob, her husband, came up behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "You've been staring at that screen for an hour," he said softly. Emily swallowed hard. "It's him, Jacob. The test, there's no mistake. Thomas Reed is my father." He didn't look surprised. "I figured as much," he said. "You wouldn't have gotten this far if you weren't sure." Emily turned to face him, her eyes wet. "What do I even say to him? He doesn't know I exist. How do you just show up after all these years?" Jacob crouched beside her, meeting her gaze. "You don't have to have all the right words. Just show up. He deserves to know you exist, Em. And maybe," he added gently, "you deserve to know him too." She looked down at her hands. "I'm scared. What if he doesn't want me in his life?" "Then at least you'll know. But I've seen the way you look at that letter from your mom. I think you've been waiting for this without realizing it." Emily took a long breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I'll do it. I'll go." That evening, she typed a message to Helen, each word carrying both fear and resolve. "Helen, I've read the results. I don't know what to feel right now, but I'd like to meet him. I just don't know how. Can you help me?" When Helen saw the notification the next morning, she froze. For a few seconds, the words didn't register. Then she gasped, covering her mouth. After weeks of waiting, it was finally happening. She reread the message again and again, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and dread. The truth was ready to come out, but how? Thomas was still unaware. He'd returned from Atlanta 2 days earlier, tired but cheerful, bringing her a small snow globe from a gift shop and joking that it was the closest thing to winter she'd get this year. He had no idea that his life was about to shift beneath him. That night, while he watched the news in the living room, Helen stood by the kitchen sink, pretending to tidy up as she thought. If she told him outright, he might think she betrayed him by keeping the secret. But if she found a gentler way, maybe the truth could arrive in a softer light. Her eyes landed on a photo hanging on the wall. The one of them smiling at Fontana Lake 8 years ago, the same place they'd met. The answer came like a whisper. Fontana. That lake had started everything. Perhaps it could hold their ending, or their beginning again. The next morning, as Thomas poured coffee, Helen leaned against the counter casually. "How would you feel about a little trip next week?" He looked up, intrigued. "A trip?" "Just a short one. Maybe a few days away. The summer's ending, and we haven't been back to the lake in years. Thought it might be nice to see it again before the cold sets in." Thomas smiled, his eyes softening at the memory. "Fontana Lake." She nodded. "Yes, just the two of us. No plans, no phones, just quiet." He chuckled. "You trying to get me off the grid again?" "Maybe," she said, hiding her nerves behind a small smile. He reached over and brushed a thumb against her cheek. Then it settled. "I'll book the cabin." Helen turned away so he wouldn't see the emotion in her eyes. "I'll handle it," she said quickly. "Consider it my surprise." That afternoon, she wrote back to Emily. "He doesn't know yet. I'll be taking him to Fontana Lake next week. It's where we first met, and maybe where he can meet you, too. If you're ready, I'll send the details. I think he'll be grateful to finally find what he's been missing all these years." Emily replied a few hours later. "I'll come, but please don't tell him who I am right away. I want to see him first, to understand the kind of man he's become before I tell him the truth. Helen read the message twice, nodding to herself. She understood perfectly. That night she began packing. She folded Thomas's favorite flannel shirts, the ones that smelled faintly of pine, and tucked the folder with the DNA report and the black notebook into the bottom of her bag. Each item felt like a piece of the story she was finally bringing to its conclusion. When she zipped the suitcase, she paused, her hands trembling slightly. The plan was simple, yet her heart raced as if she were standing on the edge of something vast. Thomas entered the room, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You're planning something," he said against her hair. "Maybe," she murmured. "You'll see soon enough." He kissed her temple. "You always make life interesting." When he left the room, Helen sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the packed suitcase. She thought of the lake, of the day they met, of the quiet laughter that had built their life together. And now, waiting at that same place, was the daughter he didn't know he had. She closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling with a mix of fear and tenderness. "It's time," she whispered to herself. The future was coming, carried on the gentle ripples of Fontana Lake, where one story had begun and another was about to find its way home. The road to Fontana Lake wound through the heart of the Smokies, curling like a silver ribbon between green ridges and rivers swollen from late summer rain. Helen drove while Thomas sat beside her, arm resting on the window ledge, watching the trees flicker past like frames from an old film. The hum of the engine and the rhythm of the road created an easy silence, one that had always come naturally between them. They'd left Asheville at dawn, a thermos of coffee between them, the air outside still cool and misted. Helen had chosen the long route on purpose, one that followed the mountain streams and gave her time to steady her heart. The truth sat heavy in her chest, pressing harder with each mile they drove. Thomas looked over and smiled. "You're quiet this morning." She forced a small laugh. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how much things change and how much they don't." He reached for her hand, warm and familiar. "I like to think that means we've done something right." She squeezed his fingers, her throat tight. "Maybe we have, but sometimes doing right also means facing things you didn't plan to." He turned to her, curious. "What do you mean?" Helen pulled the car onto a scenic overlook, a place where the mountains opened wide to the water far below. The lake shimmered under a soft gray sky, the morning light turning it to silver glass. She cut the engine, her heart thudding. "Thomas," she began, her voice barely steady, "there's something I need to tell you." He frowned, gently. "You sound like you're about to fire me from my own life." She managed a weak smile. "It's not that. It's about something I found. Weeks ago. Before Atlanta." He tilted his head, waiting. "You left a notebook in the car that day at the station," she said. "A black one. I wasn't going to open it, but I did. I read what was inside." Thomas's brows furrowed, confusion flickering to understanding. He inhaled slowly, saying nothing. "I found Caroline's letter," she continued, her voice trembling. "I know about Emily. I know she's your daughter." The world went silent except for the low hum of wind through the pines. Thomas's face drained of color. You read that?" "I did. I shouldn't have. But when I realized what it meant, I couldn't ignore it. You spent years searching, Thomas, trying to make peace with a past that never gave you answers. I thought maybe I could help you find them." He looked out over the valley, eyes glassy. His hand gripped the edge of the seat. "You found her." Helen nodded. "Logan helped me. And yes, we found her. Emily. She's alive. She's well. She's in Spokane, working as a photographer. And Thomas," she paused, her voice breaking. "I sent your DNA. I had to be sure. The test came back, 99.9% match." For a long moment he didn't move. His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the horizon. The stillness frightened her more than anger ever could. "I know I should have told you earlier," she whispered. "I just wanted to be certain before I broke something so sacred." He drew a deep breath, still looking away. Then, slowly he turned toward her. His face was wet. You found her," he said, the words cracking. "After all this time." Helen nodded again, tears spilling freely now. "She wants to meet you. That's why we're going to Fontana. She's there, Thomas, waiting." For a second, he just stared at her, as if his mind couldn't bridge the distance between disbelief and joy. Then he reached for her hand with both of his, gripping it hard. His voice came out rough, full of years he'd never spoken of. "You gave me back my life." She tried to speak, but no sound came. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly it hurt, and she let herself cry into his shoulder, the kind of tears that didn't come from sadness, but from release. When they finally continued the drive, Thomas was quiet, his gaze distant. Helen knew he was replaying everything. Caroline's smile, the promise he hadn't kept, the face of the daughter he'd never met. Every few miles, he wiped his eyes roughly, pretending it was just the wind. As the road began to dip toward the lake, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long gold fingers across the mountainsides. The air shimmered with warmth, and below, Fontana Lake gleamed like molten glass. Thomas leaned forward in his seat, his breath catching. "God," he murmured, "it looks just like that day." Helen smiled faintly. "Maybe it's been waiting for you." He turned to her then, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. "For us," he said quietly. When they arrived at the cabin near the shore, the air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. The lake stretched wide before them, perfectly still, reflecting the sky in shades of rose and amber. Thomas stood by the water, hands in his pockets, his whole body trembling with restrained emotion. Helen walked to him, standing close enough that their shoulders brushed. "Are you ready?" she asked gently. He nodded, though his voice shook. "I don't know if anyone can be ready for this." The wind stirred, sending ripples across the surface of the lake. The sun was sinking now, slow and deliberate, bleeding orange into the water until it looked aflame. The light washed over Thomas's face, and she saw the years of pain softening, melting into something new. Hope. He closed his eyes for a moment, then whispered, almost to himself, "Caroline, if you can hear me, thank you for letting her find me." Helen reached for his hand, and he didn't pull away. They stood there together, silent, watching the lake turn to gold and then to glass again, as if the world itself had paused to bear witness. For Thomas, it was as if he were being born again, not into youth, but into forgiveness. And for Helen, it was the sight she had longed for most, the man she loved finally standing free from the weight of his past. As the last light folded over the water, their reflections blurred into one, the quiet before a reunion years in the making, carried by the same wind that had once brought them together. The morning at Fontana Lake arrived, washed in gold. Mist still clung to the water, moving in slow ribbons that caught the first sunlight like breath over glass. Helen stood on the porch of the cabin, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold long ago. Thomas had been awake since dawn. He hadn't said much, but she could feel the tension rolling through him, the fragile, trembling hope of a man standing at the edge of a miracle he never thought he'd see. They had agreed to meet at the south overlook by the water, a quiet spot where the hills dipped low and the wind carried the scent of pine and rain. Helen had chosen it for the view, but also for its stillness. It was the kind of place where hearts could speak without words. When they arrived, the sun had climbed high enough to paint the lake in shifting tones of blue and silver. A single car was parked by the trailhead. Thomas froze when he saw it, his fingers tightening around the small bouquet of wildflowers Helen had picked for him to hold. "Is that—" His voice cracked before he could finish. Helen nodded gently. "Yes, she's here." Down by the shoreline, a woman stood with her husband and a small child, a boy maybe 5 or 6. The wind lifted her hair, and when she turned slightly toward the light, Thomas's breath caught in his throat. "Emily," he whispered, the name breaking like a prayer. She didn't hear him at first. She was looking out across the water, one hand resting on her son's shoulder, her posture calm but guarded. Then, as if pulled by something unseen, she turned fully and their eyes met. For a single, suspended heartbeat, neither of them moved. Thomas took a step forward, then another. His hands trembled so badly that the flowers fell, forgotten, into the grass. "Emily," he said again, louder this time, voice raw and shaking. Her husband glanced toward the sound, then gently touched her arm and nodded, stepping back with their child. Emily's eyes filled instantly, wide and wet with disbelief. She didn't need explanations, no letters, no proof. In his face, she saw her own reflection. His eyes the same soft gray blue she'd seen in the mirror her whole life. "Dad!" The word slipped from her lips before she could stop it. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks, overcome. Then, in one breathless motion, she was moving, running toward him, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes. When she reached him, she didn't slow down. She fell into his arms, the force of her embrace nearly knocking him off balance. He held her as though the years themselves could collapse into that single moment. His body shook with sobs that had been waiting decades to be released, his hands cupping the back of her head as though he still needed to convince himself she was real. Emily clung to him just as tightly, her tears soaking into his shirt. Between them, the silence filled with all the words they'd never had a chance to say, the birthdays missed, the lullabies unsung, the questions unanswered. Helen stood a few steps behind, watching through tears that came without warning. She didn't move closer. This wasn't her moment. It was theirs. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the steady thrum of her own heartbeat as she watched the man she loved become whole again. When they finally loosened their hold, Thomas brushed a tear from Emily's cheek, his voice shaking. "You look like her. Like Caroline." Emily smiled through tears. "Mom always said I had her hair, but someone else's eyes. I never understood until now." He laughed softly, a broken, joyful sound, and then pulled her close again. "I've missed everything," he whispered. "All of it. I'm so sorry." "There's nothing to be sorry for," she said, her hand resting on his arm. "You found me. That's all that matters." Her son, shy but curious, approached then, tugging at Emily's sleeve. "Mommy, who's that?" She knelt, smiling through tears. "That's your grandpa." The boy looked up at Thomas, eyes wide with wonder. "Grandpa." Thomas's face crumpled again, but this time his smile broke through. He crouched down to the child's level. "That's right," he said, voice trembling. "Can I have a hug?" Without hesitation, the boy threw his arms around his neck. Thomas held him close, eyes closing. And in that instant, something inside him settled. A quiet forgiveness between past and future, sealed by the arms of a grandchild he'd never known existed. Helen stepped forward then, her movements slow, reverent. Emily turned toward her, their gazes meeting for the first time. No words were needed. The younger woman understood. This was the person who had carried the secret, who had found her, who had chosen compassion over jealousy. Emily reached out and Helen took her hand. They shared a look filled with gratitude and recognition. Two women bound by the same love for the man now standing between them. The afternoon light began to change. The sun dipped lower, turning the water to gold once more. The 3 generations stood together at the edge of the lake, Thomas, Emily, and the little boy between them, while Helen lingered behind, smiling through her tears. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the gentle lapping of the water. The years of loss, regret, and unanswered prayers seemed to dissolve into the air around them, replaced by something lighter, something whole. As the sun sank fully behind the mountains, its reflection painted their faces in amber light. A father reborn through love, a daughter reclaimed from memory, a child bridging both worlds. Helen watched them and felt peace wash over her, deep and steady. She closed her eyes, letting the wind brush her hair, and for the first time in a lifetime, she felt time itself loosen its hold. The voice in her mind, soft, steady, certain, spoke the truth she'd come to understand only now, standing at the edge of everything that once was and everything that had begun anew. Sometimes the truest revenge against time is forgiveness. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the water, now still as glass, reflected the glow of 3 generations bound together, not by blood alone, but by grace. And in that quiet, final light, the world exhaled as if it, too, had been waiting for this reunion all along.